Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine for the previous 24 hours. We have a lot of very interesting details, a lot of very interesting geolocations and updates, so let's start. But before we start making this video, before we start discussing the situation, I would like to share with you my thoughts, my opinion about the situation in the central part and the northern part. As you can see, according to the map you see right now in front of the screen, I still haven't colored the territories of the depot, let's say motor depot. We still haven't changed the color or the territory in the central part. We still haven't changed the territory control over in the vicinity of the Blue Lake and so on. And when talking about other mappers, they have already made all these updates showing the Russian control, let's say in the Donetsk beach, in Avdiivka beach, in the central part. According to most of the mappers, the Russians have already established control over the motor depot and managed to enter this industrial area that located to the south of Avdiivka by the name of Alter Group Limited. This part, according to some pro-Russian sources, the Russians have already managed to enter the cafe by the name of Brevno, and by that to cut the main supply road. So a lot of updates, a lot of different information, and the only difference between most of the mappers and the military summary, and there are a few more, let's say, reliable sources who follow the same logic as I do, we change the map just based on the geolocations and video geolocations, and when the territory is contested or reliable sources report about this or that changes, we color this territory as a gray zone. So basically there are three colors, as you can see, three states of the territory. The Russian, let's say, red color, which means that every single street was captured by the Russians, and this this progress was geolocated and video confirmed. So when talking about the progress of Russians inside of Avdiivka, only the territory that is colored with red was confirmed by video. And let's say when talking about the central part, about lake, about the let's say motor depot, about Alter Group and so on, all these updates were made just based on Telegram posts or X social network, or based, let's say, on the deep state map updates, which is pro-Ukrainian, and sometimes people use deep state update, that's a negative update for Ukrainians, as a real source, because the logic is simple. If pro-Ukrainian map shows that Ukrainians, let's say, lost some position, that means it's true because it's pro-Ukrainian map, so that's why they will not lie, or something like this, so they're showing the truth. So very simple logic. But sometimes people and mappers are running ahead of the train, trying to show not existing progress, or sometimes a lot of mappers, a lot of reliable resources you're following, copy paste each other posts. Sometimes, let's say, we can use a simple example. Deep state map makes some changes on its map, and then a lot of mappers start copy pasting these changes to their own maps, showing that this is real progress, but sometimes without any evidence, based just on some changes on some map that we also don't know what kind of resources they were using to make this or that changes. So this is the situation. So of course it's up to you who to believe, how to follow. Anyway, we know for sure, 100% sure, that the Russians are advancing in the central part of Avdiivka, that the Russians probably managed to improve their positions around this red colored territory, and very likely the Russians managed to enter the motor depot, or even to enter Alter Group industrial zone, or to move further in the vicinity of the lake. Very likely that happened, but sometimes we are facing the wishful thinking, so we need to be very careful, because the battle for Avdiivka is entering the final phase. It's about to be cut into two parts, and it's about to create the first cauldron with significant number of Ukrainian infantry and soldiers inside. So it's better to be very careful once again, and to think and to filter the information we receive to understand the real picture on the ground. Now let's start discussion, and let's start to understand what did happen according to bloggers and according to Telegram channels during the previous 24 hours. Let's start from the less valuable area. And we are going to take about the lakes. This is Avdiivka Lake, and according to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation along the lake, managed to establish control over additional streets and to establish control completely over the Donetsk beach. This one, we have like different mappers confirm this information, once again based very likely on other mappers, like let's say Deep State or something like this. Anyway, we see additional progress, and the Russians are trying to establish complete control over the Avdiivka beach, and the most important target and the most important area for the Russians is to move further and to establish control over this strategical hill. So if the Russians are able to do this, then they will get complete strategical superiority in this territory, and it will increase the, let's say, it will reduce the days, the total days that Ukrainians will be able or are able to hold this stronghold under their control. So from this hill, the Russians will see everything that located on the southern part and the deep central part of Avdiivka. Yet we haven't received any updates about the eastern part, about this stronghold, and it's very interesting that a lot of mappers, maybe because they don't see this stronghold on their map, and they don't know the existence of this stronghold, shows at least some part of the stronghold under Russian control. But since the beginning of the special military operation, we haven't received even a single geolocated video confirming the Russian control over this territory. So we will keep this area as is. Now we are moving to the central western part of Avdiivka, probably to the most important territory. And you know, based on different mappers, we also have some misunderstanding, because different mappers show completely different situation on this territory. And let's start first of all with Moto Depot, probably the most important area. As for now, we have three different opinions about the territory. Some sources are saying that the Russians have already entered the Moto Depot and that there are very heavy clashes like Syriac Max, but he confirms that there are few barracks or few buildings that are still in the gray zone. I assume that he was talking about the building of the, let's say, post office and maybe the garages to the south and the buildings that located closer to Timiryazeva Street. And according to the most of the mappers, Timiryazeva Street still under Ukrainian control, but this is probably the most interesting part. Most of the Ukrainians says that Timiryazeva, and pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian sources reported and neutral reported that Timiryazeva is under complete Ukrainian control, and this is the defense belt that Ukrainians are trying to establish right now. But I found one very reliable Ukrainian sources. It's like Cyber Boroshno mappers. They're doing almost the same thing as I do, as Syriac, as Deep State. They have their own map. They have, let's say, tight connections with the forces on the ground and so on. And for example, they're saying that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to enter the street by the name of Сельхозтехники, this one. I can't tell you for sure how they managed to do this, how the Russians managed to do this according to them, but they're saying, and this is very important because this is completely different story, they're saying that the Russians managed to make something like this. I will show you on a map. So the Russians managed to move along the railways, bypass Timiryazeva Street, and to enter the street of Сельхозтехники. So this is something like approximate progress of the Russians on this direction. Also, they're saying this Khyber Boroshno, I usually use their geolocations, their ascenters, I usually add their, let's say, FPV drone strikes from the Ukrainian side, so they're very, very professional guys. I'm not saying that they're showing the truth, but they're saying that this is the exact Russian progress, so on this area. So the Russians managed to came behind of Timiryazeva Street, but Timiryazeva, they confirms under Ukrainian control, and the let's say motor depot is in the gray zone. So this is completely different point of view because of that fact that these centers, this source is not so popular and famous among people as like Deep State or Syriac or let's say other Russian sources. People don't follow these updates, but this is very interesting and important piece of information. Another important thing about once again about the area in the vicinity of Motor Depot. The sources are saying that the Russians, most of the sources, most of the reliable mappers, of course, confirms the progress of Russian forces of something like this. It's like 100% control over the territory. And according to the same sources, the Russians are trying to move further from these, let's say, Motor Depot in direction of the gas stations. There are two gas stations. This is the first one. This is the second one. And according to information we have, there is a very powerful stronghold, very powerful defense belt. There are trenches, there are fortifications, there are, let's say, hidden fire positions, machine gun positions, and we're talking about this territory. And the Russians are saying that currently and during the previous night they were storming this territory, because if the Russians are able to establish control over this territory, then the Russians will be able to establish control over the gas stations and to establish complete control over and to establish the first control, not complete, but first control over industrial ave. So during the previous night, there were very heavy clashes for this stronghold between the motor depot and industrial ave with the gas station. So this is the current situation on this direction. For now, let's say by 10 a.m. of the local time on the 11th of February, we still haven't received any updates whether the Russians managed to establish control over this territory or not. But obviously the Ukrainians will not count the losses, will not count the reserves and soldiers, but they will fight for this stronghold, let's say, as they're fighting for their own lives or something like this, because this is one of the most important part, which if the Russians can take this, they will cut the industrial ave physically, and then there's going to be the defense belt will be completely collapsed, and then the Russians will handle with every single direction separately. Now we're moving to the Alter Group company, to this, how it's called better in English, it's Alter Group Limited, this industrial park. According to Syriac mappers and different mappers, this territory also is under Russian control, and the Russians continue pushing and moving in direction of the Brivno. I believe you heard this funny title, Brivno. Brivno is a cafe, this is cafe, like small hotel, maybe motel, along industrial ave, right in the entrance to the chemical plant. This is it, and according to information we have, there are few strongholds in this area from the Ukrainian side. This is the first. There goes along this road to Orlyanka, and according to most of the mappers, the Russians are about to enter and capture this cafe, and the distance between Russian positions, the closest Russian positions, and this Brivno is less than 300 meters. So but let's try to calculate the distance. This is Brivno, and let's say move to this ultra limited group to calculate the distance, and this is like exactly 300 meters. So the report that the Russians, like in 300 meters from the main supply road, let's say confirms from one or other side that this industrial area is under Russian control. So this is the situation in this area. Once again, the Russians, according to information we have, currently have three main objectives. The Cafe Brivno, this one, the Russians are trying to storm the stronghold in the vicinity in front of the gas stations, and the Russians are trying to move further along Сельхозтехники Street, also in direction of Industrial Ave. So all these updates are telling us that the Russians are trying to establish a very big foothold along Industrial Ave. Why is that? Why is the Russians are trying to do this? When we summarize and understand all these things, we understand that there are just two supply roads that Ukrainians have to support their forces in Avdiivka Cauldron. The first one goes through Lastochkina, the second Orlyanka Lastochkina, the second one Severne, 9th quarter. So let's add these supply roads on map for better understanding. So once again, according to information we have, this is the first supply road that goes to Avdiivka, and this is the second supply road that goes to Avdiivka. When talking about the northern, this one is already under complete fire control, and the source reported that the distance of Russian forces around 320 meters away within the range of small arms. So like they can control this intersection, the entrance from this supply road to Industrial Ave with the small arms. And a little bit further, the Russians establish, let's say, around 800 meters away within the range of snipers, long-range RPG and ITGM, let's say, equipment and weapon. So once again, this territory, this road is already under fire control. The Ukrainians still have possibility to use Severne 9th quarter road, but for some reason the Ukrainians are not using this road, very likely because of very close positions of the Russian forces to the south from Opytne. Anyway, this area is very complicated. I have a lot of questions, a lot of doubts about this supply road, whether the Ukrainians using this area or not. But anyway, understand that within the next few days we're going to receive the final answers to this question. And this is another reason why the Russians are trying to move along the Sельхозтехники Street, this one. And the main purpose of this attack from the Russian side is the same: to get as close as possible to the industrial area and to, let's say, establish control over this territory, because this control will allow the Russians from these positions to have at least maybe not short arms, but at least mortars and artillery control over the Ukrainian positions and this supply road. Maybe this is like the purpose. The distance between possible Russian positions from here to the main supply road is 1 kilometer and 30 meters. It's already a normal distance for, let's say, anti-tank missiles or something like this. So this is the situation in this area. And today the Ukrainian sources published a very interesting video, not from the central part of Avdiivka. This video wasn't geolocated. This video was provided by the Ukrainian sources. I have added this video softly somewhere in the vicinity of Semyonovka. So somewhere to the west of Avdiivka, the Ukrainian sources published the video of significant number of fresh, clean forces, fresh, clean soldiers, battalions of soldiers who are staying on their positions and who are waiting for something. As we discussed, Syrsky and Zelensky are not going to give up, and the main, let's say, evidence that Zelensky and Syrsky are not going to give up the Avdiivka is that they still haven't made even a single move in western direction. A single meter hasn't been passed by the Ukrainian forces from the eastern direction to the west. Let's say the Ukrainians still hasn't started any retreat or withdrawal process. The battle of Avdiivka is going to be, and as I understand, due to the video of significant number of reserves and reinforcements that currently are concentrated in the western part to the west of Avdiivka, the Ukrainians are going to start deblocking operation. And you see significant number, and just pay attention, they're clean, their helmets is like shining, they're clean as never in Avdiivka, which means it's very fresh forces, and these fresh forces, very likely the Ukrainians will launch and will attack, as we discussed during the previous days, in direction of Krasnogorovka, because this is the best possibility solution for the Ukrainians, how to unblock and how to collapse the Russian northern attack from Veselaya to the south. So we'll see, but during the previous days, during the previous months, the Russians spent a lot of energy and time trying to establish control along the railways. This is the main Russian defense belt, and it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to, let's say, cross and to bypass the railways, because it's a very powerful natural, or engineering construction as defense. So we'll see. Anyway, the situation is not resolved in Avdiivka, but it's about to be resolved. We will understand the end of the, let's say, the final days of Avdiivka is during the next few days there are going to be very heavy clashes in Avdiivka. Maybe today the Russians will be able to establish control over Brevno, over the gas station, over this territory. They will cut industrial aid, and the Ukrainians, of course, why the Ukrainians are not attacking right now? Because the Ukrainians understand that the Russians still in exhausting process. Every single day the Russians are sending more and more forces, and they're exhausting and getting more exhausted, more and more and more. And after the Russians cut Avdiivka aid, the Ukrainians only then will launch a counteroffensive or deblocking operation. So we'll see how this operation is going to finish. Anyway, this is going to be a very bloody counterattack, but once again, the main purpose of Zelensky and Syrsky not to win the battle for Avdiivka. The battle of Avdiivka has been already lost. The main purpose is not to give up Avdiivka until the end of the president election campaign in Russia. So not to give Putin this victory as a media victory for his election process, for his election campaign. So we'll see. Now we are moving to the south. We have additional progress in Pervomayska. A lot of mappers updated their maps showing the additional Russian progress, that few more streets were captured by the Russians, and now that this is the current progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation on this direction, yet without any geolocated confirmation. The same story we are receiving from let's say Novomikhailivka direction. We continue receiving updates from this territory. We have different mappers showing let's say, additional progress. Some sources are saying, like Syria, that the Russians established control over the cemetery. Other sources, like Yulian Ryobke, the analytic from Bild, reported that the Russians managed to restore control over the cemetery and over the farms to the south of Novomikhailivka. So according to another report from Syria confirming the same. So according to pro-neutral and pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians returned control over this territory. If you remember, these two areas used to be under Russian control in December of 2023, but then the Russians took a decision to withdraw their positions, to abandon them because of heavy counterattacks from the Ukrainian side. Anyway, the situation of Mikhailivka also develops not in Ukrainian favor. I don't think that Ukrainians are going to fight for the village as they are going to fight for Avdiivka. The only purpose in this area is to win as much as possible time, as it's the most important thing, and this is the target that very likely the Ukrainians are able to achieve. Another important thing is going from the line between Vodyana and Stepnoye. According to information we have, the Russians continue advancing, and during the previous few days, maybe or hours, managed to establish control over additional fields in direction of Vodyana. So the Russians continue advancing, and I start, let's say, asking myself a lot of questions, and the most, let's say, interesting questions I have to myself: what the Ukrainians are planning to do with this sector, because with the Russian further progress along the road between Salotke and Vodyana, this territory is getting, the situation for the Ukrainians in this area is getting worse and worse, and there might be a period encircled. And obviously, if the situation develops the same way, and if, let's assume, the Russians are able to establish control over additional fields to the west in direction of Vodyana, then the Ukrainians basically will be forced to retreat from these fields, and this will allow the Russians to maintain and shorten their positions, to reduce the number of forces required, and to use the released forces somewhere else, or increase the pressure against the Ukrainian positions to the north of Mykolaiv. Anyway, by the time the Russians capture Novomikhailivka, which obviously will take place somewhere in 2-3 weeks, the Russians will be able to get the main supply road between Ugledar and Konstantinovka, and right after the battle for Novomikhailivka, the battle for Ugledar is going to start as well. So the front line is collapsing either. Now we're moving to northern direction to Bahmut Artyomovsk area. As you can see, we also have significant number of geolocations, details, reports, posts, and so on. And once again, most of the mappers continue updating the maps without any geolocated confirmation of such a progress. Let's start from the north. According to when talking about Bogdanovka, we continue receiving FPV drone bombing of the Russian forces in the central part, which confirms this, that Ukrainians still control the central part of Bogdanovka. Obviously, Bogdanovka is strategical village for them. When talking about the foothold between the strongholds between Bogdanovka and Popovo Forest, most of the mappers have updated their maps, showing at least this area under complete Russian control. Yeah, I think, and when talking about this stronghold, I think we can agree with the mappers, and I agree that very likely this is the progress in this area, but still we haven't received a single geolocated confirmation of that. We have, furthermore, we have some video how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians, who were, as you can see on this video, retreating and withdrawing their positions. So the Ukrainians on that video was moving something like this along the railways in direction of Chasiv Yar and Canal, and the Russians were FPV bombing them on their way. So this is like something like more or less reliable evidence that the Ukrainians withdraw their positions and the Russians after captured this territory. When talking about Popovo Forest, according to the most of the mappers, just as of 1 day of clashes, the Russians established complete control over this territory. Very likely it happened, but let's wait a little bit more. We need more geolocated confirmations. We have just one geolocation of Russian offensive operation, but no geolocations from Popovo Forest side. And now we have some analysis from different mappers, from different analytics, saying about the further Russian progress to the Chasiv Yar and so on. But as we discussed in the previous videos, there are few defense belts in front of Chasiv Yar. Few. The first one is the, let's say, stronghold right in front of the Russian positions. This is the first defense belt. And as we discussed about the strongholds of Ukrainian forces let's say, between Bogdanovka and Popovo Forest, it took place 40 days for the Russians to reduce this defense bolt till molecules and then to attack. So very likely the Russians are going to spend almost the same time to penetrate this defense belt as well, because Russian sources reported that the Russian reconnaissance reported that the Ukrainians managed to finish and to complete successful rotation. They removed every single soldier from Chasiv Yar direction. They were obviously exhausted and very tired for clashes with Russians in the Bogdanovka and Popovo Forest. They were completely replaced by fresh forces, very fresh forces of special units of Ukraine and territorial defense battalions. So the Ukrainians are ready, even though if the Russians are able to reduce the time they need to take control over this defense belt and to force the Ukrainians to step back further to Chasiv Yar. Anyway, we need to understand that the next defense belt is already Chasiv Yar. So this is one of the most biggest and, let's say, powerful strongholds of Ukrainian forces on Bahmut direction, this one. And it's not something that the Russians can take control over the 40 days. It will take a lot of time for the Russians to establish control or to enter canal. Obviously, when, let's say, if nothing special and unpredictable take place, if the situation is going to develop the same way as it develops right now, the Russians are going to have to spend a lot of time to enter canal. Furthermore, they're going to need to establish control, the Russians, over Bogdanovka, let's say, about this territory, because to storm canal just from one direction is suicide operation. The Russians, let's say, to complete their mission successfully to enter Chasiv Yar, first of all, need to take control at least over all these territories, including Ivanovska. Without Ivanovska and without Bogdanovka, there are no chances to storm canal. So that's why I assume that before even attacking this stronghold between canal and the Popovo Forest, the Russians will waste some time. They're not going to be in a hurry, because for now the main goal of the Russian forces is to establish control over Ivanovska. And today we got another geolocated video of fabbing or tossing of Ukrainian positions to the north of Ivanovska. On this video we see probably the arrival of FAB 500. A few minutes and a few seconds later, a few episodes later, the Russians were bombing the same forest with TOS flamethrower system, with multi-launch rocket systems. And I remind you that this is not the first video from this sector. The Russians were working with this area, were bombing this area for a very long time. Since the beginning of January, we got a significant number of geolocations, a lot of strikes, so this area is already ready for further Russian offensive operation. So once again, before storming Bakht Canal, before storming this main stronghold in front of Canal, the Russians obviously will attack Ivanovska from the north, because this will allow the Russians to first of all, to solve completely the question with Klishchiivka, Avdiivka foothold, and to get as close as possible to canal from the south and to Chasiv Yar. So this is going to be the next Russian purpose. Furthermore, according to some sources, the Russians have already entered Ivanovska. Maybe they were forced to withdraw their positions and to step back, because we continue receiving updates of FPV drone bombing and attacking, striking against the Ukrainian positions on the southeastern part of the village, which confirms that very likely this territory is still under Ukraine control or something like this. But important thing also is coming from the main supply road that goes from Chasiv Yar to Ivanovska. Today the Russian sources published additional video of FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian checkpoint somewhere here, and now we see that the Russians establish full fire control over the main supply road that goes from Chasiv Yar to Ivanovska, which means that the Russians try to reduce the rotations, supply and support, let's say, to ease their further offensive operation. And if we increase the numbers of updates even from the beginning of February, we're going to see that there were at least 3 geolocations from the same area. So it's 100%, let's say, supply road control from the Russian side. As you can see, there is a Seversky Donbass river, there is a probably bridge that was restored by the Ukrainians, and this road goes to Ivanovska. And the Russians just try to reduce the Ukrainian possibilities, and so the next target is Ivanovska. Obviously, the question is when exactly the Russians are going to enter. Of course, we're going to receive more updates about some progress maybe on the south and eastern part, but until the Russians enter the forest, only after the Russians reach this belt, defense belt, then we're going to receive the massive updates about further progress in Ivanovska. When talking about Chasiv Yar itself, the Ukrainian authorities took a decision to start the massive evacuation. Civilians, hospitals, command centers, headquarters, engineering, different centers. So everything, every military infrastructure currently is moving from Chasiv Yar in direction of Konstantinovka. So now the main center of defense is going to be Konstantinovka, and Chasiv Yar is going to be something like Bahmut, the city that located on the line of combat contact. So this is the situation on this territory. Important and interesting updates continue coming from Belohorivka. As you can see, I have adjusted the map because we finally received the geolocated confirmation of Russian progress inside of the village. On this video, we can see the FPV drone bombing of Russian positions inside the filtration station. So that's why we adjusted the map. Also, we have another geolocation of how Ukrainians of 81st Air Mobile Brigade were bombing the Russian positions to the east of Belohorivka. They were destroying the Russian tanks with demining equipment and so on. So that's why we have adjusted the map in front of Belohorivka. Furthermore, other sources reported about significant progress inside of Belohorivka itself, and according to some sources, the Russians have entered even few streets, let's say in the lowland of Belohorivka. We're talking about Первошатравнева Street, Kirova Street, Pravda-Zhovtneva Street. So according to some mappers, pro-Russian mappers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over something like this. For now, we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of that, but we start receiving updates, and very likely this, at least it looks like the truth. But we need more time to understand, and I believe that today, on the 11th of February, we're going to receive more updates about the situation. When talking about Terny, we have also adjusted the map. If you remember, this stronghold, this, let's say, this area by the name of Gloves, a piece of glove, it's like, you see, that's like a gloves, was under Russian control, used to be under Russian control, but today the Ukrainian sources published the video, the Russian sources published the video of Ukrainian counterattack. The Ukrainians, using the personal carrier, were moving in front of Russian positions, but this personal carrier got on mine and was destroyed. This video confirms that the Russians were forced to withdraw and abandon these positions, and now we color this territory as a gray zone because the Ukrainians neither have control over this territory. Furthermore, we have geolocated video of FPV drone strike against the Ukrainian tank in front of Terny, which also we were using as the, let's say, reason to adjust the map. But according to Russian mappers and the different mappers, the Russians continue advancing in direction of Terny, and that the clashes on this direction continues. The same story we can say about Sinkovka. The Russians continue advancing, and they have already established control, according to mappers, of control over a few streets over the northern part. The Russians managed to dig in deeper. The Ukrainians stopped making any attempt to force the Russians to step back. So obviously soon we're gonna see the renewing of clashes and further Russian progress. Now we are moving to Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Russians also intensify their activity on this direction. Very likely in the very near future, the Russians will make another attempt to attack Staromayorsk. This is going to be another media victory, mainly because Staromayorsk was captured by the Ukrainians during the greatest counteroffensive summer 2023. And now the Russians start bombing not just the edge positions to the south of the city, but also the Russians establish certain, let's say, supply control over the main road between Rovnopol and Staromayorsk. And very likely the Russians within the next few days are going to attack this area in two directions. This is the first possible direction of Russian attack, and this is the second one. Very interesting updates are coming from Aburabotino, Zaporizhzhia area, and updates are very weird. First of all, I reminded that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation removed this sector from the reports of the Ministry of Defense, and which is very interesting why they did this. And according to geolocations, real geolocations, we have certain Russian progress. According to information we have, the Russians managed to establish control over this piece of Rabotina cake without geolocations. This was reported from the Russian more or less reliable resource, and we have FPV drone strike against the Russian positions to the west of the captured territory. So very likely that maybe the Russians conducted some offensive operation and captured this territory. Very likely. We have another Russian offensive operation with a significant number of armored vehicles that took place to the northwest of Rabotina. And the video was published by the Ukrainian sources of significant, not significant, probably few tanks and a few personnel carriers were heading in direction of Ukrainian positions. Some tanks were destroyed with anti-tank missiles, anti-tank weapon. Some armored vehicles got in mines, so there were very heavy clashes. Currently, we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to get some success, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 armored vehicles were involved in that attack. After the Russians abandoned some armored vehicles, the Ukrainians start FPV droning them with significant number of FPV drones. But anyway, we see the direction of Russian attack. According to all these geolocations, the Russians were heading in direction of this tree line. From the short scope, from the global scope, they were heading forwarding, moving further. So based on these two events to the west and northwest of Robotyne, we can make a clear conclusion that during the previous days, the Russians were trying to establish control over something like this. Very likely the Russians managed to achieve some results, some success, yet we don't know for sure where exactly the Russians were stopped. But anyway, we see that the Russians still have in their plans to restore control over Robotyne. But the strange thing, why they removed this front line from the Ministry of Defense report, maybe something like act of conspiration. The sources reported about very big problems in Krinky. The situation with Starlink is very bad for the Ukrainians, not just in Avdiivka, but in Kherson direction as well. There is one legal problem from the Ukrainian side, because when the Ukrainians were signing a contract with the Starlink, probably with maybe with NATO countries, probably they requested and asked Starlink to provide internet on the entire territory of Ukraine. And according to Ukraine, Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia area, according to the Ukraine, it's Ukrainian territory, right? So they sign a contract, and now the Ukrainians are paying money, or maybe the NATO paying money, or Pentagon pays money to Starlink for working of this station above the entire Ukraine. But the problem is that most, let's say 20% of territory of Ukraine is under complete Russian control. And now the Russians got access to Starlink, and they're buying them from the Middle East, from United Arab Emirates. And because of that fact that basically we can say that Pentagon and NATO pays for Russian Starlink. The Russians just need to get the stations, and because of that fact that the access to the internet was prepaid by NATO and Pentagon, now the Russians are using the Starlink for free, and according to them, they managed to improve their positions, to improve communication significantly. And this is a very big problem for the Ukrainians, because Ukrainians from their side have some problems with Starlink, with internet connection. Very interesting situation is taking place around Elon Musk, and for example, yesterday he published a very interesting post in X social network saying that it is time to stop the meat grinder. Should have been done a year ago, and all these things completely connected with the, let's say, with the getting access to the internet by the Russians. So very difficult to understand, but as I understand, Elon Musk, until the end of the president elections of Donald Trump, will receive significant number of problems with the from the Joe Biden administration. Very likely he's going to get a lot of problems, as well as the Tucker Carlson, the interviewer, a journalist who interviewed Putin recently. So we'll see what is going to be next. Let's see, interesting video, let's say, at the end of this story. Let's take a look at very interesting video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. The Ukrainians, as well as the Russians, try to find a solution how to secure the soldiers on the ground from FPV drone strikes. And on this video, we can see the Ukrainian equipment, possible equipment, how to fight against the drones. So you see that this weapon should help the Ukrainian soldiers. Maybe the next versions or improved version of this weapon should help the Ukrainian soldiers to avoid FPV drone strikes from the Russian side. Maybe it's a very smart solution, who knows, we'll see. And but at least for me, it looks very interesting, very smart and very interesting, and this might help either the Russians and the Ukrainians in the future to reduce the losses among the personnel against when the FPV drone strikes. And let's say the final report is coming from Germany. Germany is getting ready to receive another 10 million of refugees from Ukraine after the Russian victory. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.